Hello everyone, Stepan here. Welcome to the last video in the series about the French defense, and in this video we are going to go over the Byrne variation and the variations which occur after bishop g5 on move 4 for white, so not going for e5 the Steinitz variation or anything else in the classical. If you are unfamiliar with the French defense theory, I would advise you to watch the video I made on the basics first. I will link it in the description below, and I will also link all the other variations and the videos in which I cover each one in detail. So after e4, e6, of course, the French defense, d4, d5. White doesn't go for the advance with e5. White doesn't play anything else, the exchange or something. He plays knight to c3, which is the Paulsen or the classical French defense. And black doesn't play the winnover with bishop to b4. He plays knight to f6, continuing the classical variation of the French defense. And now the most common move is pawn to e5, so a pawn push by white, which is the Steinitz variation of the French. And the second option for white is bishop to g5, and this is the Byrne variation. However, black's next move could enter a different variation in total, but I believe that all of them share a common name, Byrne variation after bishop to g5. So black can choose between three moves in this line, and continuing the Byrne variation is the move d takes e4, immediately striking at white's center and shattering the pawn structure. And this is the Byrne variation. The sidelines and the other variations which occur after bishop to g5 for white on move 4, we are going to cover after the main line. So after d takes e4, there's basically only one move for white, and that's recapturing the pawn with the knight, so knight takes e4. And now you can already notice that the knight on f6 is attacked twice, and there are two ways to defend the knight. One is bishop to e7, and the second one is knight b to d7, which is considered a sideline. We are going to go over that first. So after knight b to d7, black is hoping that white would capture, and that would improve his structure. This is similar to the Karpov-Caro-Kann, in which you always play knight b to d7 in order to be able to recapture an f6 with your knight, thus developing your, let's say, useless b knight on f6, which is the best square for the knight in those closed positions. Here, of course, white won't take the knight. He plays knight to f3, reinforcing his center, reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing to castle. h6 by black. And now the most common way to capture is with the bishop. With the knight. Capturing with the bishop would be unfavorable, so knight takes f6, knight takes f6, and now bishop to h4, simply saving the bishop, going away from the h-pawn. And here, as in most French defense positions and in Caro-Kann positions, because this actually resembles a couple of variations of the Caro-Kann, especially the Karpov variation, black aims to strike at white's d4 pawn with the move c5. And the move c5 is twofold. Firstly, you're going to activate your bishop on the most useful square if white captures. Secondly, you're going to have more central pawns, because of course, if in this position white remains with 3 pawns on the queen side and black has 2 pawns on the queen side, that means that white has the pawn majority on the flank, and it will leave black with the pawn majority in the center, because white doesn't have the e-pawn nor the d-pawn if he captures. So after c5, white shouldn't ever take the pawn. The best move is bishop to b5 check, developing a bit tempo, bishop to d7, blocking the check, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and here the most common move is queen to e2. And after queen to e2, white is preparing to castle queenside. He could also castle kingside. However, castling queenside gives him a lot more attacking prospects, especially since the queen has naturally developed to d7 after recapturing the bishop. So here black has to restrain white from doubling his pawns on the f-file, so bishop to e7 is played to be able to recapture with the bishop if white ever takes. And now white castles queenside, black here in this position doesn't do anything about the pawn. Black in fact has a slight advantage in this position with the move castles. And you should of course let white capture the c5 pawn if he wishes to do so. So after castling, white's best move is to capture the pawn. So now d takes c5 and queen to c6 is double attacking the pawn. The only way to defend the pawn is with the move b4, which is just a bad move. You should never play that because your king will be too weak. But of course, if you decide to capture the pawn with the bishop, then after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, black's king is also unsafe. So if you capture the pawn, capture it with the queen. So this is the sideline. After bishop to g5, d takes c4, knight takes c4, you play knight b to d7, and this is played less often than bishop to e7, so it's a very good sideline to know. Just remember that after this h6, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop to h4, you should play c5. This is the most important move in this variation. If you don't play c5, you're basically going to be worse and white will have an advantage. But this variation is okay. And here, even though you are giving up a pawn, this gives you a lot of attacking possibilities and a lot of piece activity, and definitely something to work with along the c file. And white, if you're playing this with white, then you should always at some point play king b1, as Ben Feingold would advise. So that's it. After knight takes e4 on move 5 for white, the most common move is to play bishop to e7, simply defending the knight that way and preparing to recapture with the bishop. In this position, white should take with the bishop. Bishop takes f6, not with the knight. Because if he takes with the knight, after knight takes, bishop takes, you have to take with the bishop anyway because your d4 pawn is falling, and if you move the bishop away to e3, then your position is just too passive, and after a move such as knight c6 and castling, black stands better. So bishop takes f6, and here black could choose between two moves, gf6 and bishop f6. You might be surprised, but taking with the g-pawn and ruining your pawn structure is the most common way to capture. Taking with the bishop is okay as well, and we are going to go over that first. So bishop takes f6. Taking the bishop with the knight is a bad move because you are you're basically giving black your extra opening tempo. And after knight takes bishop, queen takes bishop, black has one extra developed piece, and black is a tempo up and much better. So you should play knight to f3, not doing anything about the bishop. Black castles. Queen to d2 is the best move, once again preparing to castle queen side and attack black's king. Knight to d7, castles, and now bishop to e7. If you want, you don't have to save the bishop. You can play b6 in this line, developing your bishop to b7, and that's also good. But just remember that after castles queenside, you can either play bishop e7 saving the bishop pair, which is an advantage of course, however this position is closed so it isn't as obvious, or you can play b6, because if white ever decides to capture on f6, knight takes f6, you have just won another extra tempo, so that wouldn't be a good idea for white. So this is the sideline, bishop takes f6. After bishop takes f6, you can take with the g-pawn, which is the main line. So after gf6, you have of course doubled your pawns, but you have a lot more attacking prospects. And if you remember, if you have watched my videos on the Bronstein-Larsen variation of the Caro-Kann, this position is somewhat similar to that, and similar ideas can be applied. So if you want to play aggressively with black, this might be a good option, following the main line of the Byrne variation. Here white plays knight to f3. And black plays f5, chasing the knight away, gaining a tempo. Knight c3, a6. This is a very important move in many variations of the Byrne French, because a6 is restraining the knight and the bishop from coming to b5, which is a key square in this position for white to attack from, and the key square which black has to defend. Now white will continue with g3. Another reason a6 was played is to be able to play b5, fianchettoing your bishop but with extra space, not playing b6. Bishop g2, bishop to b7 castles, and in this position black is best advised to castle kingside. So after castles, this is the starting position of the main line. Now, if you asked the engines, the position is completely equal, but there are imbalances in the position which give both sides great chances. Firstly, black's kingside pawn structure is ruined and the king is far less safe than white's king. But on the other hand, black is always threatening to play the move c5. And if c5 happens, then black stands okay. And black has the bishop pair anyway. So black has the bishop pair, white has a better pawn structure, and the position is perfectly playable for both sides. So if you want to play the Byrne variation, this position on move 11 is something that you have to memorize. And if you are familiar with this, you should find middle game ideas by yourself. And I will link some prominent players of the Byrne variation in the description below, so you can watch their games and study from their games. My advice is that if you want to play this variation with black, you should go over at least 20 or 30 games over the board without an engine to try to realize what they were doing during the game, and that's the best way to learn a variation. Okay, let's go over the sidelines now. So bishop g5, d takes c4 is the main line, knight takes c4, bishop to e7 is the main line, bishop f6, g takes f6 is the main line, and this is the position which occurs after normal opening moves. You are aiming to play a6, b5, bishop b7, and castle kingside. After bishop to g5, after white decides to go for the Byrne variation, not for the Steinitz or something else, you have two more good options. The first one is to play bishop to e7, and this is continuing the classical variation of the French defense, which occurs immediately after knight c3, knight f6. But it's tough to categorize all of the variations, so I think this should be the Byrne variation anyway, even though it's classical by transposition. Here white has only one move, that's e5, expanding in the center, and black has only one move. Of course, playing knight to e4 would be a bad move, playing knight to g8 would be a bad move as well, so knight f to d7 is the best move for black, saving the knight. Now the main line continues with bishop takes e7, queen takes e7 of course, and now f4. And black in this position plays a6, and that's to prevent any piece from coming to b5. Now, if instead of f4 here, white immediately tries knight to b5, threatening the c-pawn, then black should simply play knight to b6, covering this and preparing to develop the other knight to d7, so black is okay. Of course, you have a problem with the French defense bishop, which is now even harder to develop, because you can't play b6, bishop b7, and you are actually making it harder to play c5. So this might be a good sideline idea for white and trying to confuse black, but it's perfectly playable for black, and it's in fact all zeros according to the engines, it's completely equal, but it's a fun idea to try out. So if you are white, after queen takes e7 you can play either f4, which is the main move and the best move, or knight to b5, which is a good idea as well, because you are forcing knight to b6. But let's get back to f4. After f4, black plays a6, preventing knight to b5. And here, knight to f3 is played by white, and if you know the basics of the French defense, then you know that black is usually attacking on the queen side and expanding on the queen side, and white is doing the same thing on the king side. So white's plan is to play f4, knight to f3, and black's plan is to play c5. So in this position you have to look for a pawn break, that's either f6 or c5 in the French defense, and in this position c5 is the best move. You are opening up the center, striking at white's pawn structure, and you are preparing to develop your knight to c6 after your pawn has already moved, because you want to gain space and open up things for your bishop. White should react with d takes c5. Now you don't have to recapture immediately, you can play knight to c6, that's the best move. And here, if of course white tries to defend with b4, you simply take it, so you're going to recapture on c5 anyway. And this is the main variation of the classical French occurring after the Byrne variation with bishop to g5 on move 4. Now of course both sides have clear plans. You can watch the videos on the other variations to learn them better. And black is simply trying to develop his bishop, castle, play f6, open up the position, and advance on the queen side, while at the same time white is going to castle king side and have pressure along the king side, especially along the f file. Okay, so after bishop to e7, the classical variation, e5, knight f to d7, bishop takes e7 is the main move, continuing the classical, and after knight f to d7 there's a very interesting move that white could go for. It's a hyper-aggressive attacking move, which I believe is one of the best variations of the French defense, and definitely the most attacking way to play for white against the Byrne variation. And that's the move h4. And h4 is the Alekhine-Chatard attack, and that's a pawn gambit, because now black plays bishop g5, hg5, queen g5. Black has won a pawn. However, firstly, white has a couple of tempi which he could gain, and secondly, white has a menacing attack along the king side, and black has to be extra careful not to mess up and lose out of the opening. White plays knight h3, gaining a tempo on the queen, queen e7, knight to f4, a perfect square for the knight. Looking at the black's main weakness in the French defense, the e6 pawn, which makes it extremely hard to ever push f6. Here knight to c6 should be played by black, not going for c5, because you simply don't have time. You have to react, you have to develop. Queen to g4, attacking the g7 pawn, g6, and white castles queenside. And if you are an attacking player and if you like attacking chess, I believe that this is the perfect setup for white. On the other hand, if you asked the engines, they will always prefer black in this position, and this is minus 0.7 or minus 0.6 for black, so almost winning on grandmaster level, but practically speaking, white stands better, I believe, and black will always have to look out for tactics. Black's king is at least 3 moves away from castling, and castling kingside would be just losing immediately. So this is the Alekhine-Chatard attack and the Alapin-Diame gambit. And I believe that if you are white and if you are playing against the French defense, this is a variation to remember and to play against black. And you will most probably beat people with this variation, especially in blitz chess. Okay, let's go back. So this was bishop takes e7 on move 6, and bishop to e7 for black on move 4, the classical French after the Byrne variation. The third line after bishop to g5, the Byrne variation, and d takes c4. And after bishop to g5, which is not d takes c4 or bishop to e7, is bishop to b4. And this is a hybrid between the between the Byrne variation and the Winover variation, and it's called the McCutcheon variation of the French defense. And I believe that's a great way to play. Now, the good thing about this variation for black is that it's really straightforward and that there aren't almost any variations for either side. So you basically have to remember about 10 moves and you will be okay. And the theory is really easy to remember. White plays e5 here, once again gaining space, and black plays h6. This e5 isn't winning the knight, of course, because you can play h6, attacking the bishop. And if white takes the knight and you take the bishop, then black stands better, because you are opening up the h-file and you're going to be able to have a lot more activity than white. So the best move for white is bishop to d2. You can also go to e3. But d2 is considered to be a better square. However, in the bishop d2 line, you're going to have to waste another tempo to get the bishop to d3 to e3. After this, black is best advised to take on c3, bishop c3, and here you take with the b pawn, because if you take with the bishop, then you're constantly going to have to defend the d4 pawn, white's main weakness in the French defense, and this way you are safe. Now knight to e4 should be played, attacking the bishop. And now queen to g4, attacking the g pawn. And here you can take the bishop immediately, but it's almost losing. And if you take the bishop, then queen takes g7, and of course you don't have the time to do anything to save your knight or something. You have to play rook to f8, and you are losing immediately. So black here plays g6, bishop to d3, now attacking the knight. Knight takes d2, king takes d2, and now c5. Once again, the thematic pawn break for black in the French defense. You're opening up the center. You're planning to develop your light squared bishop, finally the problematic French defense bishop, and you're planning to play knight to c6 in some positions, developing your knight. Here white continues with knight to f3, bishop to d7, developing the bishop, dc5, queen to e7, attacking the c pawn. There's no way to defend it, but with queen to b4, which would be unfavorable. Rook a to b1, attacking the b7 pawn, bishop to c6. And this is, one could say, the starting position. Now, of course, if white does play queen to b4 trying to defend the pawn, then after knight to d7 you can double attack it, and the e5 pawn is weak as well. So this is the McCutcheon variation and the Lasker variation of the McCutcheon variation. I'm sorry for the complications, but the names in the French defense are quite complicated. And this position is equal. Black has equalized, and I believe that black stands slightly better even, because after you recapture the c-pawn, the material situation is equal and white has obvious weaknesses. However, you should always be careful about white sacrificing something on g6, and you basically have no place to castle, and you have to realize that your king is going to be stuck on e8 for a while, and that your position is quite unsafe compared to white's. But if you manage to exchange queens and survive the middle game, then any endgame is better for black because of the weaknesses on e5 and on c3 and c2. Okay, so that's the McCutcheon variation, the Byrne variation, the classical variation, and most sidelines. And I would like to finish up the videos on the French defense theory with this, and I hope you got to learn something. Once again, I would advise you to watch all of them. You can find the links in the description below, and definitely before going into too much detail with these variations, watch the video on the basics. Now, once again, after you study these videos, I would advise you to go through at least 20 or 30 games in each variation to develop your own ideas and to get the best out of Grandmaster games. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching. I hope you got something in this video about the Byrne variation, and stay tuned for more chess. Thanks very much. Bye.